This, my friend, is the Music Ed Mentor Podcast, and I am your host, Elisa Jansen-Jones. You can follow all of the great content like this podcast, blog posts, free workshops, and online courses at musicedmentor.com. Today's episode is a bit different from our typical episodes where I bring on an expert and we talk about practical improvements to your teaching and your life. Today's episode follows a story. It's about a boy who had all the advantages in life, but still had a hard path. A challenging path that, though extreme, and you'll see what I mean, might have echoes of your own life in it. I want to let this story inspire you, so I'm not going to give away too much because I want you to hear it mostly from him. Jake Douglas is today's guest, and he was raised by affluent parents and was one of only 2 children. He was introduced to music at a very young age. He began taking Suzuki flute lessons at the age of 4. He went on to learn piano, alto saxophone, vocals, drum kit, and percussion. And even still, he practices between 1 and 3 hours of drums per day. And you'll see why that is. Meanwhile, he has founded and is building a music education company with lofty goals. In fact, you can learn more about what he's creating to help music educators and, more importantly, music students by checking out practicingmusician.com. I mean, have you noticed how students who take private lessons not only improve their own skills, but the skills of the students around them? Do you ever wish that every student could have some kind of private instruction experience to help them along, especially those who seem to be struggling? How different would your classes look? How much better could they sound? And how much faster could you progress? Well, that, my friends, is the goal of Practicing Musician, to bring the private lesson experience to every student and simultaneously close the achievement gap for students who need extra help while providing the extension opportunity for the students who are already excelling. Now imagine that not only all of that, but it's free for your students. And half the money that they do make also goes right back into the schools. If you want to be one of the first to learn about the opportunities with Practicing Musician, visit their website, practicingmusician.com, and enter your email address to stay in the loop. You'll be kept up to date with product development, beta testing opportunities for your students, and how your school can be one that receives funding. Go to practicingmusician.com to sign up. I'll have a link in the show notes for today's episode as well. Now, before we get into Jake's pretty tragic and inspiring story, a big thanks to Smart Music for making this podcast happen. They truly care about music education and have created some of the best tools for you as a music educator. Have you checked out the Smart Music blog lately? Not only will you discover the show notes for all of our past Music Ed Mentor podcast episodes, but lots of other outstanding articles on topics ranging from recruitment and retention to classroom management and repertoire selection, and so much more. Be sure to subscribe to Smart Music's blog so you get updates and never miss an episode of this article or that podcast. Wait a second. Reverse that. This podcast or that article. I also need to offer a COA. You should know Jake's story includes references to drug use, possibly sex, and incarceration. If that's not your thing, or if you have little ones in the room, you may want to skip this episode or put in headphones. You have been warned, my friend. Now, cozy up to a cup of hot chocolate and get ready to be inspired.
So my name is Jake Douglas. I am the founder and CEO of Practicing Musician, which provides world-class music education to everyone everywhere. And I have been working on that project for about 3 years. It is very dear to me. And I've talked with Elisa a little bit about my history. So I want to start by asking everyone listening and yourself, Elisa, what is it that you care about most?
Gosh, I like to break my life down into 2 categories, right?
Okay.
One is contribution and the other is experiences. So contribution is like being a mom and being a teacher and doing this podcast and all the stuff that I do for music teachers is how I contribute. And then The other thing I care about is having great experiences, which is why I exercise so that I can go on long, wonderful hikes and mountain bike rides and I can travel and all of that. So those are the things that are important to me.
Well, that's interesting that you say that because I haven't really broken it down into those two categories, but I largely view the things that I care about most in the same way. And I actually think that the experiences that I have had throughout my life allow me to contribute to others more effectively. That is really the premise of the next 45 minutes or so, is talking about the experiences that I've had and why I believe every single person should have access to instrumental music education because of the catalyst for change that it was in my own life. If any of the listeners out there have other experiences that you utilize in your contribution to your students or to your family or to anyone in your community, I think that those are some of the best ways that we can relate and help others to develop a healthy living style. So I ended up going to school at the Claremont colleges, specifically Pitzer College in Claremont, California, to study psychology. I was one of those people who grew up in a family of doctors and was told music is not an education or a career choice. And that was, I don't know if it was detrimental, but it certainly steered me away from doing what I cared about most, which was playing my drum kit. Today, I still play 1 to 3 hours of drum kit, 6 days a week. I compose piano pieces. I sing nursery rhymes with my 4-year-old daughter. I collaborate with world-class musicians on practicing musician. And I play in a couple groups and whatnot. So I'm still very active musically. In fact, I spend the vast majority of my time engaged in musical activity of some sort, whether it's education or performance. When I was younger, I was always pushed to, and I say pushed deliberately, I was pushed to engage in sports every single season. I was pushed to get the best grades in my class. I was pushed to volunteer. I was pretty much active from the moment I woke up till the time I went to bed. And there are some aspects to that that I really appreciate and some that I wish I could have been different. What that gave me is a very, very good work ethic. It also was very stressful as a teenager, which led to, by the time I was 12, experimentation with alcohol. And by the time I was 13, losing my virginity. And by the time I was 14, smoking weed and taking hard drugs regularly. These types of behaviors really were somewhat to mitigate that push that I felt from my family to excel at every single thing that I did. The conclusion that I've come to since I got sober 4 years ago is that in my experience, I am noticing these things happening to kids at younger and younger ages. Now, I was very young when I started doing started drinking and doing drugs and whatnot, but I was the youngest person that I knew to begin drinking and smoking. And now I know some kids that I teach that are much younger than that are engaging in these activities. And especially with some of the negative consequences that I suffered because of these, because of the behavioral patterns I exhibited, I was in situations such as juvenile hall and jail and whatnot, where there are kids that I don't even know how to say it, but they are never provided opportunities like I was pushed to excel at. On December 23rd of 2006, I was taking out my girlfriend. I won't go into the whole story about what had just happened in our relationship, but what ended up happening that night was that I flipped a soft top convertible and ended up in juvenile hall for a week, which was on Christmas. I was in juvie on Christmas. And while I was in the mess hall eating for the hour that we were allowed out of our cells, one of the kids, well, they gave us Christmas presents, and it was a bag of candy, and I'm sitting there, and I'm getting, obviously, it coming from a very fortunate family, the worst presents I've ever received at Christmas. One of the kids comes up to me, and he takes the candy from the table in front of me, and he replaces it with the candy that he was given. And he said, "Here, you take this. I like yours better." And despite the fact that I was highly estranged from my family at this time, I would have much preferred being at home in that tense environment that was largely created because of my own actions than sitting in a mess hall with a bunch of kids that I didn't know who were stealing the candy that was gifted to me because it was better than the one that they had received. One of the guards actually came up to me, and he said, "You see these kids in here? I see a lot of them every year at this time, and they will get arrested on purpose because their Christmas is better in here than it is at home." These are the types of experiences that that I put myself in. It's really that I put myself into these experiences more than anything. In hindsight, what I've come to really realize is that there are a significant portion of children and that grow up to be adults that are never afforded the opportunities that people like myself or people that are probably listening to this podcast take for granted. Those are the kids I know as music educators. Most music educators I speak with really want to see the proliferation of music education to the point where everybody can access it, and there's budget restrictions or any number of factors that go into ability for everybody to access music education, even in a free setting like a public school. I mean, 94%, I think NAFMA says 94% of public schools offer music education. And we have to think about, well, how many students can actually afford an instrument, or how many schools can afford instruments to provide to their students so that they can engage, or how many students are interested in traditional band and orchestral classes. Really, even though it's accessible in 94% of schools, we have to understand that means 6% of the students out of 55 million students in the United States, that's about 2 million students, don't even have the opportunity to be engaged in a public music school program. And then there's all these factors that lead people to either not engage because of financial means, or because of personal preferences and what they personally prefer isn't offered. Or, I mean, we all kind of know these barriers to entry into the art form that is music.
All right. So you go to boarding school after rehab, and this is all before your senior year of high school?
Well, this is during my senior year of high school. So I'd been at this point using hard drugs very heavily for 3 years of my life. Like to put into some context where I was doing 7 grams of cocaine daily at this point, but I was also supposed to go to state in tennis. I got second place in the district championship, and then I was supposed to go to state, but I ended up in rehab. And, I got first place on a trebuchet that I built in my physics class. And so, to put into perspective, I kind of had all these healthy passions, all of these opportunities that my parents had pushed me into, like I was talking about. I see them kind of as neutralizing agents to the unhealthy passions. Needless to say, my sobriety didn't last very long because I wanted to fit in. And I graduated. I had gotten into, as I mentioned earlier, the Claremont colleges. That was my number one choice. Very prestigious consortium of 5 undergrad colleges, a graduate program, and a school of theology just east of LA. And Pitzer was my main choice, 900 student school. There were many opportunities for music, but I had just gotten out of rehab. I'd been pushed so hard my entire life to do my best constantly, and I just wanted some time off. So I ended up taking a year off and working 4 in the morning at Starbucks, working at noon at a restaurant. It was 70 to 80-hour weeks, continuing my drug and alcohol abuse afterwards, going to bed and doing that for an entire year and realizing I was barely able to make rent that way and I really should go to college. So I guess during that time, I got arrested 2 more times.
The listeners can't see it, but I am shaking my head like every other sentence that you say, Jake. Okay. Sorry to interrupt.
You should be. It
Lisa's
was,
shaking her head. Okay.
yes. Well, and I meant to start this podcast with a disclaimer that I talk about some of these things, and it might sound like I'm positively recapping, but really it is that I've gone over these experiences in my mind so many times that I've desensitized myself to the absolutely horrible feelings associated with them at the time and for many years afterwards that actually perpetuated that vicious cycle that is drug abuse. So I in no way intend to have this be a positive account of drug and alcohol use. But yeah, so the second arrest during that year was my 5th arrest in total, my rap sheet, and that's not the amount of charges, that's the number of arrests. I end up going to Pitzer College, and my first year, freshman year, I am on house arrest, well, dorm arrest, so I can't leave my, 10-foot by 15-foot dorm unless I'm going to class. And I have outpatient 3 times per week. Everybody else is just getting to school and starting to learn about independence and freedom that I had been fighting for the last 6 or 7 years of my life. So at this point, even though I was primarily just smoking weed and drinking alcohol, I wasn't really doing hard drugs again. I became somewhat of this guru, dispelling the darkness of not knowing about substances and their effects on our physiology and mental states. And so I ended up really accelerating my drug and alcohol use again because I had experiences, I had stories, and it was captivating. My peers who had never had these experiences were somewhat enchanted because it was something new to them. So if that paints a picture of what comes next, yes, I did end up getting back into drugs and alcohol very heavily, to the point where I'm studying psychology and neuroscience. So I'm understanding not only the physiological effects of each individual drug in every sense of in every sense of the effect, from the most reductionist point of view, how it affects our neurotransmitters, and to how it actually affects our way of interacting with our environment. I'm also then aware of how to cheat the system. So I'm going to outpatient and I am literally drinking while I'm there, while I'm sitting in outpatient. And I am teaching the woman who is the therapist leading all of the groups about the information that she doesn't know, because I understand how drugs affect our physiology at a different degree and different level than she does. So she, one, doesn't ever suspect that I'm doing drugs. And when she does, I'm able to cheat the system to get around it. So I never got caught. And this is, I don't even know how to say it. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that for me, it was somewhat of a factor of pride, I would have to say. I can do this. Nobody can tell me not to do it. Even if I get a little slap on the wrist, which that's what I considered those 5 arrests, even though one of them took 6 months of my life away in rehab, I can still do this and I can get away with it. And that's the thought that I had. This is my life. I get to choose what to do with it. The only reason you're suffering is because I'm doing something that you don't want me to do. That was my mindset. And that it's incorrect. I understand it wholly to be a faulty line of thinking now that I have experienced. I will have been sober now for 4 years. So I have now experienced dating somebody who is deep in their addiction. I've experienced family members and friends who are deep in their addiction. I mean, many of my friends are either dead or some are homeless. Some have been in mental institutions. I have all types of friends that drugs got the better of them. And so I know very well it is not just, it is their life. They can do with it what they want, and it shouldn't affect anybody else. Now, there is an element of, yes, it is their life, but their actions very much do affect the people around them, which is why the judicial system acts in the way that it does around these types of behavioral patterns. It's why people become uncomfortable. It's ingrained in our nature. So that line of thinking is faulty, but it is very reminiscent. Just looking back on how I was thinking about these things.
So did you make it through college?
Oh, yes. So while I was attending Pitzer, I became the manager of the sound crew and event staff. I ran not only all the live events on campus, but I ran sound for them and managed the teams that would set everything up. And sometimes I'd be playing in 3 to 4 bands in a single night. So I'd set everything up, then I'd have somebody run sound while I was playing in bands, and then I'd tear it all down, and then I'd have to go do my homework. And this whole time I'd be on copious amounts of drugs and alcohol. I was president of the Music Coalition, which was our music club on campus. I served in an all-student-run restaurant. I was heavily involved in what we called a POA. It stands for Pitzer Outdoor Activities. And so I would take, weekend trips to Zion. Zion, I think I'm saying that right.
Good job. You're saying it right.
Thank you. Excellent. Canyons or Joshua Tree or any number of national parks to go climbing or hiking or whatever. And I graduated in 4 years with a BA in psychology with a 3.3 GPA. And so, yeah, I dedicate a lot of that to the push that my family gave me, despite how stressful it was. School was easy because I had such driving parental figures, I suppose, throughout my childhood. It was just something that I did. It wasn't something I had to try and do. It was just, yeah, I do this. And so, again, it's that neutralizing agent that I was talking about earlier. But I do want to say, by the end of my college career, the amount of drugs and alcohol that I had grown to ingest amounted to a half a gallon of whiskey, 2 to 8 other drugs, weed, and a pack of cigarettes every single day. So you can think about, you go to a bar or something, you see they're pouring your whiskey out of a bottle. That's 750 milliliters. I was drinking 1.75 liters of whiskey every day, plus whatever other beer was in my immediate vicinity, and taking hard drugs every day. So it was bad news. The choice I made after graduation was to stay in LA to play music. I was in multiple bands consistently throughout my college career. And one of them in particular was the very first band I joined. We ended up calling ourselves Story and the Tellers. Story Scheinberg is the leader of that group. She's still down there playing. She's an amazing guitarist and vocalist. And, I'm studying psychology. I've been told music is not a viable education or career path. And I'm sitting there with somebody who started MCA, one of the 4 major record labels. And I'm just playing in, or at least one of their family members. And so I'm studying psychology. I'm doing just as many music classes as it would take to get my master's. But I'm now seeing, wow, I have this real possibility of making music a career. Not only a career, but I could go really far. So that's part of the reason I started playing drums so not only frequently, but such great lengths of time. And I stayed in the LA area to play music with that band afterwards. The only really healthy passion that I had left, now that my education was completed, I wasn't manager of any of the live events. All my jobs that I had were on campus. I'm no longer a student, so I'm not doing them. I'm solely focusing on music. And I'm playing drum kits 6 to 8 hours a day. Whereas before I'd be playing a couple hours a day. I'd be doing homework. I'd be running the live events. I'd be working at the student-run restaurant. I'd be leading the clubs. I'd be playing in bands. I'd be doing all these different things. And that was 12 to 14, sometimes 16 hours a day. Just go, go, go. Now I had 6 to 8 hours. That's a lot of time to be playing music, but I had nothing else in my life. So the rest of the time, I didn't have anything driving me forward. And this is when the copious amounts of drugs and alcohol that I was using to fuel that motivation, or really that I needed at that point to be that motivated, because I didn't used to need those external stimulus to be motivated before I was 12, 13, 14, when I really started doing those drugs and whatnot. That was just gone. The driving force was gone. So the effects, the consequences, the side effects, really, those caught up to me very quickly. I could tell quite a few stories about some bizarre things that started happening. If I were to boil it down into one word, it would just be depression. I mean, alcohol is a nervous system depressant. Even the ecstasy and the Molly and different things are all acting on serotonin, which means that you're not producing the same amount of serotonin as you normally are, or if any at all. And so that keeps you happy. There is less oxytocin. The dopamine obviously was low. So I didn't have any. I was just depressed, and it manifested in the way where I was playing 60 hours a day, but the majority of my time that was not spent playing, I would be lying in bed watching Netflix. I didn't even have Wi-Fi or a TV, so I'd be watching it on my phone. Like, that was my life. A little bit of that time, I should say, throughout pretty much high school and college, I spent a lot of my time. I've always been interested in self-regulated learning, and I'd spend a lot of my time watching videos on how to play whatever musical instrument I wanted to learn better. And I sought out the best teachers that I could learn. So some of my time was spent doing that while I was lying in bed. It was actually during that time that I came up with the concept of practicing musician, because I really realized that the platforms available, whether it be YouTube, which is solely video, or things like Guitar Tricks, Drumeo, Jam Play, Flute Land, any number of solely instrumental music education platforms. What they lacked was the ability to simulate the private instruction experience, because they can show you videos and they can give you sheet music and you can learn, but you're never going to get feedback from them. And if there was a service that provided feedback, it was for a high premium, which then makes it inaccessible for a large portion of the population. So I did spend my time doing that. And what really led to my actual sobriety was flying home for Thanksgiving. We'd all go down, my entire family would go down to a beach house that my grandpa owned just north of Lincoln City in Nescoin, Oregon. Every year we'd play cards and go into the town, watch a movie, all cook together. And I was pretty much drunk the entire time, stealing liquor from his hard liquor cabinets and whatnot. And when they decided to go into town on Sunday, I told them I didn't want to go, and I ended up drinking myself into a blackout by 3 o'clock and waking up at 8 p.m. to my mom shaking me awake. And I just told her I'm done. This is not because I'm getting arrested. I'm not having these feelings of remorse because I've gotten caught doing something. This is not, I'm going to die here. I can't function anymore. So I flew back down to Claremont the next day, and I was sober for 4.5 months. I flew down to Claremont. 2 days later, my house got robbed. I was kicked out of Story and the Tellers because of my excessive drug and alcohol use, and there was nothing tying me down to LA anymore. So I packed up my stuff and moved back home. Another, fortunate thing that most people don't think about, or maybe they do, but my mom let me stay in her house, and she nursed me back to health. It took a very, very long time, but that's something that, a lot of people don't have, or a lot of families might get fed up with dealing with their kids on a constant basis, saying that and then relapsing and saying that, relapsing. And I can definitely understand. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be taking care of somebody if they're lying to you constantly, but I think she knew that I was actually ready to stop using. And so she stepped in and she really played her part. I was sober for 4.5 years, cold turkey from alcohol. I was still smoking weed. I was not doing hard drugs. And 4.5 months later in March, I was in so much pain, physical pain, from the withdrawals and from the fact that I had been playing drums 6 to 8 hours a day, which to begin with is a lot. But then I was under the influence, so I couldn't feel myself playing drums. I couldn't feel any of the effects of any of the movements I was doing. So my joints were completely shot. So I ended up starting to drink again. And I had to devise a way in which I could really get sober. And this is probably pretty apparent to anybody listening at this point, but I'm stubborn. So I didn't want to go to rehab. I didn't go to AA. I didn't do anything like that. I'd already done all those things. I understood their principles and their methodologies. And I also knew the statistics. I knew the data, and I knew that largely those programs are ineffective, at least long term. People might go, but most people relapse. And I didn't want to put myself in that situation. So I created my own treatment plan based on not only those principles and methodologies, but then my understanding of psychology, which is the mental states, the behavioral patterns that got myself into that position in the first place. My understanding of neuroscience, how largely in this particular scenario, how external stimulus was interacting with my physiology. And then I came across yoga, meditation, and nutrition. But it's really important to understand the reason why I decided to get sober. That's really what I want people to take away from this entire podcast. I was playing 6 to 8 hours a day, and I was getting worse. And I know that it was because I had developed my ability to focus and my self-awareness through the discipline of learning to play an instrument that I was able to observe that deteriorating health. And that's what a lot of people don't have in their life. They don't have something that they care enough to even notice that they're deteriorating, that their health is going through some degenerative process.
So let me get this straight. Your big aha turning point moment was when you realized, work as you might, you weren't getting better. In fact, you were getting worse. And because you cared about it so much, that's why you changed.
Yes. Something that I had spent, I always go back to Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. And he talks about to become an expert in something, you just do it for 10,000 hours.
Right.
A little more complicated than that, but that's the general premise. And at that point, I'd played easily 10,000 hours worth of music in my life, probably even just drum kit. So I'm supposed to be this expert. I'm playing in a band with, the granddaughter of the president, COO of Universal Studios, and I'm getting worse. And then I get kicked out of the band, which is confirmation that I'm getting worse. Not only with my playing, but with my ability to interact with people. And it was the music. It was the music, that passion that was the neutralizing agent before. All the healthy passions were neutralizing agents before. Then I lost most of them. And I could see that the last healthy passion that I had left was deteriorating, and I was going to pretty much die soon. And I had a choice right then and there. And I was given that choice or I was maybe afforded that choice because I had all of those healthy passions. And that's really what a lot of people, like the kids in juvenile hall, like people that I've met in many other situations throughout my life, they don't even have any of those opportunities. And so that's really the reason I created Practicing Musician. So I chose to really develop willpower. And what I ended up doing was I found out about yoga. Yoga, most people think about it as you're doing some poses and whatnot. I
Stretching.
realized
It's eloquent stretching, right?
eloquent stretching, yes. So that's Western yoga. That is called asana. Asana is one of 8 limbs of yoga. Yoga literally means union. This actually is very important because it's part of the premise too for practicing musician. Yoga means union. And we have to ask ourselves, well, okay, union of what? Is union of the mind, body, and the spirit. And if we're looking at the Latin term spiritus, it literally translates to the English word breath. So we're trying to sync our mind, body, and breath, some autonomic nervous system function, the breath, with our mind, our ability to control that, and our body, which is the manifestation of our mind in a lot of ways. So we're syncing up those 3. And, but in Western society, we think about it as, well, I'm doing some stretching, but really that's 1 out of 8 limbs. So it's 1/8 of what the whole system of yoga actually is. What I ended up doing was getting a yoga teaching certification almost immediately. I realized how beneficial this would be, and I wanted to learn very in depth how I could grow my own practice, but also how I could use it to help other people. And after I obtained that yoga teaching certification, I applied the yogic methodologies to musical instruments, and I taught that in a studio setting. Because what I realized is that music is the ultimate yoga, because you're syncing up what your mind is thinking with what your body is doing with the musical instrument. And you're trying to sync it up with your breath. And not only that, because you have a musical instrument, there is an external stimulus that you're actually trying to sync up your mind, body, and spirit with, rather than just I'm stretching, right? But then there's even another bonus, which is that you're trying to sync up what your mind, body, and spirit are doing with that external stimulus, which is the instrument. You're trying to sync that up with what other people are doing with their mind, body, spirit, and external stimulus in present moment. So to me, music is the ultimate union. And that, because yoga is I've heard some yogis talk about yoga as the ultimate tool for self-realization. And it is the original scientific method, because it's leading you to that realization. If you follow the yogic path, you will come to it. You don't have an option. You will become realized. That's what they say, at least. But that's why I think it's so important for every single person to be able to access music education, and the ability to learn how to play an instrument. Because in hindsight, that's exactly what happened to me. By noticing that my health was deteriorating, I had, as I said, developed my level of focus and self-awareness to a very high degree.
I love that you just made some really great points that I'm trying to think about. What is it that we're actually striving for when we're talking about improving our lives or improving our health, and you nailed it. It's self-actualization. And why do we seek that? Because when we realize our own divinity and kind of own it, that's when we can handle everything in our lives. And we're gracious and full of joy, which attracts people to us and attracts us to things. And how can you possibly not live well in every sense of the word once you've reached this point of self-actualization? And maybe that's why we do love music so much. Some of the most rewarding private lesson experiences or school teaching experiences that I've had have been with people who need it physically the most.
Itzhak Perlman. I mean, that's a prime example. Somebody who has polio is told you're never going to be able to walk or play violin, and he's still one of the most well-renowned virtuosic violinists in the world. He might be in a wheelchair, but his upper body still works just as it should, because he has that passion, because he is training himself daily. In yoga, they call that sadhana, daily spiritual practice. His spiritual practice is the violin, and it has kept him healthy enough to be able to play with the world's premier orchestras as a soloist. I mean, that's phenomenal.
And I think that's one of the issues that we have as music teachers is we spend all of our time in college becoming these, outrageously good musicians. And then we get into the classroom and we're able to teach, but we don't practice anymore. We stop playing our instruments sometimes. We maybe will occasionally pick up something that we didn't get to practice as much if we have to teach it. Like I took up guitar because I was never taught guitar and took it up completely on my own. But we forget the complete and utter joy that we get from playing our instruments, something that was pushed on us maybe as kids, but that we've owned into our adulthood. How do we get back into that?
I largely view this life as energy, and I'm not talking about necessarily in like a new age, hippy dippy kind of way. I'm talking about it in the sense that if somebody is trying to learn something new, there's going to be a learning curve. That learning curve is different depending on the amount of knowledge or experience a person has aggregated up to that point that is somewhat similar to that new experience. We can recall information easier the more that we recall it. And it becomes a strengthened neural connection. So if there has been that loss of discipline, I would call it a discipline. If there's been that loss of discipline or practice or performance, and someone is trying to gain that back, think about it as if you're trying to either learn something new or as maybe even if you're a child. Children, when they first start to crawl, they're crawling for maybe 4 little shuffles. Then they don't have any energy anymore. Then the next time they do it, they're doing it for 6. Then they don't have any energy. Then 8, right? They're just slowly increasing that amount. They're doing it at more frequent intervals. And then over time, they're building up that strength and that discipline to be able to do it to the amount that they actually want to. And they're getting joy out of it because they have the muscles to be able to do it. It's no longer strenuous on their physical body. Integrate a practice that is at specific intervals. It could be once a week, but if it's at the same time, you're doing it at the same time, you're going to be fully present eventually at that time for doing that activity. If you're doing it, it could be once a day, it could be 3 times a day, whatever it is. But the consistency, the ability to recall, the energy levels, those are all going to be strengthened by implementing those types of practices.
And it has to be something that you're passionate about. And I think we forget that. Like I said, we get into teaching and maybe that's our day job and we forget how passionate we should be. But, I find that the greater the passion, the greater the motivation.
Oh yeah, 100%. That's the one of the concepts I've been trying to convey, maybe with too many words this entire podcast. But we need to be passionate about something, and we need to engage in that regularly, because that is going to make all the difference. Having that is the driving force that makes everything else easier to do.
We're talking about New Year, New You. And I have issues with New Year's resolutions, specifically because we're resolving to be better, but sometimes we resolve it without having a plan in place. And often we make this big leap, which then, initiates burnout, basically. We don't do it little by little, like you said. We may plan it into our lives, but maybe it's something that we end up losing our passion for. So let's say that we do want to set some sort of resolution, and I'm going to call it more of a goal, right? Like something that a dream that we want to achieve over the next year. How do we go about doing that in a really productive way that doesn't force us to get burned out so quickly and easily?
Building a foundation, I think, is the most important aspect to a change that is long-term. So we can think about it. There's a great Salman Khan TED Talk where he's discussing the flipped classroom methodology and why Khan Academy has been so successful in K through 12 classrooms. And he's talking about the necessity of building a foundation of knowledge. We're giving students a test. The best student in the class might get a 95%, and then we're moving on to the next concept. And it's like even the best student in the class doesn't understand 5% of the information. How over time are they going, like that hole in their knowledge is going to affect knowledge in the future because it has to build upon itself. And you wouldn't build a house and have the inspector come in and say, well, you know, I see the foundation is laid. I'd give it an 80%. Go ahead and build the building. They wouldn't do that. No housing or commercial real estate inspector is going to say, well, this foundation is at 80%. Go ahead and build the building or do the remodel. They wouldn't do that. So to create change that is lasting, you have to actually understand the first steps to whatever it is that you're trying to change. You have to build a solid foundation, and you have to do it slowly enough that you won't get burned out. That is different for every person, but you can kind of intuitively know. I would say run some tests on yourself. Try engaging in whatever activity you want to do for 10 minutes a day or 10 minutes every other day or whatever interval it might be. And if that is too strenuous, if that's taking up too much of your energy, then go down to 5 minutes a day. Or if it's not enough and you want more, then do 15 minutes a day and slowly increase over time until you're at the amount of time and the frequency that you want to be doing something. This way, it is no longer a discipline. That's I think what most people don't understand is that they think, well, this is hard now. It will all babies learning to crawl and then walk, and then all of a sudden everybody's walking all over the place. We don't think it's hard anymore. That's how any activity or any New Year's resolution will be if you build a solid foundation. At first it's hard, and then eventually it just is a part of you.
You know, I was in the Grand Canyon. I'm hiking down. I'm a little more than halfway down because it's quite a hike down, in case you didn't know that. It's the Grand Canyon for a reason. It's a mile descent. I mean, like vertical and, 8 miles down or something. Anyway, wow. I'm somewhat down and we're at this little rest house. And these other two guys come up and they're like, hey, how's it going? What are you guys doing? Are you going down to Phantom Ranch? Are you going to go right back up? And anyway, we chat with them for a bit. And I said, well, guess what? It's my birthday today. And they were like, no way, happy birthday. And the one guy gives me a high five and he's like, it's my birthday in February. I'm turning 40. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm turning 40 today. Anyway, so we're laughing about this. And he goes, actually, this is part of my 40 adventures before I turn 40. And I was like, really? That's such a cool goal. I actually did 400 outdoor adventures before I turned 40. And he was like,
nice.
What? And I was like, yeah, I mean, they weren't all like hike the freaking Grand Canyon. They were little 5-minute things sometimes. But the point was to be consistent about it and to do what I could in the time that I had. And so that's how I was able to reach this goal. And before that, I did a trail every day for a year. And before that, I did read 100 books in a year. But you're right. It's do what you can in the time that you have and with the ability that you do have. But also don't beat yourself up about it if for some reason you're like, but I'm going to do 10 minutes a day. And then one day you're like, I did 5 minutes. Oh, no.
I would say more so than the amount of time spent is the quality of your attention while you're spending that time. Mm-hmm. That's the most important thing. You could spend 5 minutes and have the most high quality attention and get more out of that than an hour where you're completely distracted and you're not fully focused on the activity. I heard somebody, Mark Passio, talks about it as the spiritual currencies, and it's even embedded into our language. We talk about you spend time. It's like you're spending money, right? You spend your time and you're paying attention. You have to pay it. And so if you can understand those two things, that those are the spiritual currencies, and you can develop a way to enhance the time that you spend and enhance the quality of your attention while you're spending that time, I mean, you can literally do anything, but you have to understand those two principles and how that works first.
But yeah, I never thought of that as we spend time, we pay attention.
But yeah, I mean, also if you're thinking about the Grand Canyon story you're just telling, I mean, this guy who's done 40 is thinking that you're doing 400's like amazing, and you're just like, well, I just did it, right? You're like, I don't know. It didn't seem hard. Yeah, sure, it's a high number, but that's just part of me.
Yeah, the hardest part was, and I had this same experience when I did my 100 books in a year. I actually ended up with like 105 or something, but
Wow.
they weren't all easy books. There were some tough ones. Like I read an unabridged version of Les Miserables, which took me the entire month of April. And this year was one of the most challenging years of my life. I mean, I spent an entire week at my computer running an online conference, and I spent an entire month where I did not do a single trail because my dad passed away. And I had a
I'm
really,
sorry to hear about that.
yeah, I had a really, really hard time dealing with that. But the reason I was able to recover so quickly is because I got back on my adventure goal. And I got back out there, even if it was for just 5 minutes.
Yeah, and I mean, that speaks not in the exact same way, but to having those healthy passions as neutralizing agents. You went through a very traumatic experience, and the things that were keeping you going were the things that you cared about that are not harmful, that are only, they're beneficial to you. And so despite the fact that one of the most traumatic experiences a human being can go through happened with your father passing, you were able to bounce back because you had things that you cared about to engage in during that time.
Yeah, and it made me learn so much about exactly what you said, being, indulging in your passions and
Yeah, it's important to understand the profound impact. I mean, as music educators, I'm sure everybody listening has experienced this, but the profound impact that we can have without even realizing, just by being there, to lead the group as a conductor or to lead the students as their educator, in either engaging in or learning the form of expression. It's a form of expression, and that form of expression is healthy, and that form of expression, it acts to just, it neutralizes. I keep going back to that word, but it's a neutralizing agent. It helps us to get over the things that would otherwise, we might not be as resilient. You're trying to resist doing something. All that you're doing is keeping that thing that you're resisting in your mind.
mm-hmm.
So you're not replacing it in your mind. You're saying, I'm still going to think about this thing. I'm just going to think I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, worry. This is one of my favorite quotes. Worry is manifesting things you don't want.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, it's simple. I learned the distinction between simple and easy. Easy is anybody can do it. Simple is the concept is easy, but it's difficult to actually implement. That is a difficult thing to implement, to not worry. But if you can figure out how to do that by replacing those worry thoughts with thoughts of love, or thoughts of compassion, or whatever higher vibrational, I mean, getting into some energy things again, but higher vibrational mood states, you will attract people that are in love and compassion rather than people that are complaining or worrying or whatever. Like, you're attracting those things. If somebody's hearing you complain, maybe somebody who doesn't complain doesn't want to sit there and listen to you complain. They don't want to sit there and listen to you worry, but the people who are worrying and complaining themselves, they'll sit there and listen to you, and then they'll do it, and then you're around that. And you, even just at that bigger state, it's like that. You're attracting those because that's what you're putting out. That's what the people who are attracted to those things, they do it themselves. It is very important to understand.
Replacing a habit, though, instead of trying to, erase a habit from our mind, we can reprogram ourselves almost to have a better habit.
Yes, 100%. And that's where I was going, is that I tried to quit cold turkey. It didn't work. I was in too much pain. So what I did was I systematically removed my addictions, and I went from very gross to very subtle. So I went from drinking a half a gallon to, not overnight, to a fifth a gallon, not overnight, then to just beer, then to less beer, then to less beer, and then I finally quit. So what I'm doing is I'm training my brain. I'm replacing one extreme or gross stimulus with a lesser stimulus, with a lesser one, with a lesser one, with a lesser one. Eventually, I'm not drinking at all. And then I'm replacing the foods that I'm eating with more and more subtle foods, more nutrient-dense foods, which are replacing all those nutrients that I lost because of the drug and alcohol addiction. And so then I'm rebuilding instead of degenerating, I'm regenerating. And it's a process, and you have to understand the process, and your body will only allow you to do as much as you can at that time. That we think that we fail at our, going back to the New Year's resolutions, we think that we fail at our New Year's resolutions, but we're just trying to do too much of one activity at that time. If we're building that foundation and we're slowly systematically building it up, or slowly systematically replacing something that we don't want in our lives with that new thing, we'll be successful. Everybody, that's built into the nature of human beings. It's not some magic thing. That's how it actually works. Again, watching babies, that's how they do it.
I hope you enjoyed hearing Jake's story of transformation. It reminded me of why I do some of the physical things that I do. You know, the things that keep me sane, and like playing French horn in my community band, or practicing ukulele covers every night before bed, and hitting the trail at least 5 times per week. I'm not joking. Less than that, and I go crazy. If you're ready to make these same types of lasting transformations, here are the bullet points we covered. Have a practice you're passionate about, something that excites you. Build up your strength little by little. Practice the same time every day, and be consistent. You don't have to do everything at once. You just have to do one small thing every day. Soon it will be a habit. Big thanks to Jake for sharing his story with us. Remember, his goal is to bring the private lesson experience to all of your students at no cost to them, while also giving back to music programs like yours. Be sure to visit practicingmusician.com and enter your email address to stay in the loop and be the first to know about this great opportunity. I'm also happy to announce that Jake will be presenting at the International Music Education Summit, where he'll be using his psychology expertise and research to help find more ways to close that educational gap with our students, that achievement gap with our students, so that we can improve our own teaching and our students for the better. Pre-registration is now open, and you can find out more at musiceducationsummit.org. If you use the coupon code MusicEdMentor20, that's MusicEdMentor20, it's all one word, you can save on your registration and pay the lowest price ever. And as always, my friend, a big thanks to Smart Music for making this podcast happen. Thank you for spending this time with me, for sharing this podcast with your like-minded music educator friends, and for helping more music educators find us by subscribing and rating this podcast. While you're online, check out the show notes. You can also check out our whole new website, musicedmentor.com. I've consolidated, and I can't wait for you to see it. You'll find links to the show notes pages, relevant and practical articles, and even some free workshops you can do for PD credit. That's musicedmentor.com. Now, my friend, go refill your cocoa cup and keep teaching on.